Good evening, good evening, good evening, and a very warm welcome to tonight's launch event for Speak Up for Your Planet. I'd like to start with a few housekeeping points. In case you hadn't already noticed, we're using the webinar version of Zoom tonight, which will allow us to present all our speakers in an appropriate fashion. As such, there is no chat facility, and the raise hand feature will not be responded to. You do have, however, the Q&A option, through which I would encourage you to post any questions that you have for the speakers throughout the evening. Anytime you feel appropriate, you can post on there. Those questions, time allowed and appropriateness, of course, will be passed to me by a moderator at the end of the evening when we have our Q&A sessions. That'll be after all the speakers have concluded their talks. Before that, we will have 4 excellent speakers sharing their views. Each will be talking for around 10 minutes. It's probably worth noting that the speakers themselves, indeed no one else, can see or hear you. You should only be able to see the current speaker. And at the end of the speeches, of each of the speeches, we will run a short poll. And after those speeches are all finished, we will conclude with our Q&A. The intention is that this event will be over by, at the latest, 9 p.m. tonight. And please do note that the session is being recorded. So, moving on then to the substance of the evening. It's no secret that a huge amount of concern over the state of our planet is arising today. For a start, we ourselves have found ourselves this week competing with such austere characters as Prince Charles and David Attenborough for airtime. Evidence of the significant degradation, or at least the changes to the quality of life support systems of this planet, have been growing rapidly for at least 40 years. Our improving ability to measure and monitor the impact of humanity on this planet is showing us in increasingly high resolution just how much damage is being done. It's also an uncomfortable fact that many people feel that those with vested interests in maintaining the status quo have often taken control of the debate. The lingering sense that FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, has been used to slow and indeed quash attempts to take meaningful action against environmental damage is leaving many concerned that nothing, or at least far too little, is being done. Meanwhile, others believe that the facts are being wildly exaggerated, or fear that enemy states are whipping up public outcry in order to undermine our relative political strengths or economic strengths. So some members of the Toastmasters International group and the Rotary Club who've been aware of this issue rising as a theme in our clubs and indeed in our social circles as well as our homes wanted to provide a wider forum for the sharing of thinking around how we as average citizens can best support the environment. We're not a political movement, it's important to say that. We are just some normal citizens who hope that by raising the standard of debate and aim to deepen understanding and hopefully build more agreement on the subject. It's obviously a tall order, but knowledge is power. So tonight we launch with an excellent group of well-informed speakers, some of whom stand at the forefront of this issue. Others who have taken time out to gather information that's valuable to us all. So let me start, if I may, with Bob Ward. Bob is the Policy and Communications Director for the Grantham Institute. The Grantham Institute has a vision of achieving a sustainable future with zero carbon emissions. It does this by promoting the discovery of new inventions that will help reduce carbon emissions, promoting innovation, helping taking applications to market, and in helping to train people throughout business, throughout policy-making environments in order to promote better decision-making. He is also the co-chair of the London Climate Change Partnership. And, as if that wasn't enough, he's the Policy and Communications Director for the Centre for Climate Change, Economic and Policy. So certainly he is a man with his finger on the pulse. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Bob. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to the Rotary Club and Toastmasters International for asking me to talk to you this evening. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to run through 3 key global environmental problems. I'm going to start with climate change and concentrate on climate change, but then I'm also going to talk a little bit about local air pollution and then biodiversity loss. So I'm going to try and share my screen and show you my presentation for the evening. And hopefully you will all be able to see it. Very good. Okay, so on we go. So this is a set of slides that help lay out where we are with climate change. This is a graph compiled by the Met Office and 2 US-based meteorological organizations, NASA, GISS, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They all compiled their own record of global temperature, and this is a graph showing how it's developed since 1850. And what you should note here is that we are currently above 1 degree warming since the late 19th century. Now that doesn't sound like very much compared to daily changes in temperature, but that's a global average. To help you gauge the significance of that, the difference between the global temperature today and the global temperature during the last ice age, when the ice sheets came down to just north of London, was only 5 degrees. So a degree of warming is getting close to historically the highest amount of warming we've seen since the end of the ice age 12,000 years ago. This is what a map of global warming looks like. This is the average temperature across the planet last month in August. The dark red colors are the highest amounts of warming. You'll see that in general, but not quite everywhere, everywhere is warmer than it was compared to a baseline in between 1961 and 1990. Let me draw your attention to the fact that warming is greatest in the far north and in Antarctica, and indeed parts of the Arctic this year have experienced temperatures that are about 10 degrees above average. Indeed, Siberia has had temperatures so high they've actually had forest fires during the course of this year. Here's another key indicator that shows us what's happening with warming. This is the Arctic sea ice extent measured in September. Now, it only goes up to 2019 because we haven't finished September yet, but September 2020 is going to be the second lowest on record. But there's a very clear downward trend. Arctic sea ice is disappearing, and within the next few decades, we expect Arctic sea ice will completely disappear during the summer. What's driving this? Well, there's now no doubt amongst experts that it's being driven by rising levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is the measure of carbon dioxide showing how it's been going up. It's now well above 410 parts per million. Before industrialization, it was at 280 parts per million. And so it has risen by about 40% since pre-industrial times. And the overwhelming driver of this is the burning of fossil fuels. Deforestation also makes an impact, but it's mainly the consumption of fossil fuels that's driving that rise. And here's a figure showing how global emissions of carbon dioxide from energy use have been going up. In 2019, it's estimated that there was about 37 billion tons of carbon dioxide were released from the use of carbon dioxide. Why are we worried? Well, we can already see the impacts all around us. The impacts are happening all over the world. You will have seen the forest fires in Western United States as a clear link with the drying that's going on as temperatures elevate. You will have also seen that this summer we had heat wave conditions briefly at the start of August. Hundreds of people in the UK died during that. There wasn't very much attention for it because we're all focused on COVID, but that reflects a pattern that we're seeing every year in the UK now. But the thing that we really worry about are crossing major thresholds in the climate system that can have disproportionate impacts on our way of life. Let me draw your attention here to Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. Between them, they're both, the land-based ice sheets there hold enough water to raise global sea levels by about 13 meters. And so that won't happen overnight, but we can certainly see, if we carry on with current warming trends, a rising global sea level of more than a meter by the end of this century, which will have a major impact on, particularly on people who live in low-lying coastal areas. And these tipping, so-called tipping points, are points beyond which either we reach a point where you can't reverse the impacts, or they become unstoppable, or they start to accelerate out of control. And you'll see that the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet, the latest estimate is the tipping point between 1 and 3 degrees. Indeed, there are some scientists who think we've already passed the tipping points in Greenland and West Antarctic, and that the complete destabilization eventually over many centuries is now inevitable. Now, we are trying to tackle climate change. The landmark Paris Agreement, signed in 2015, 2 key commitments in that. It's now been signed by every country, although the US is in the process of withdrawing under Donald Trump. The first commitment was to limit the rise in global temperature to well below 2 degrees. And remember, we've already experienced more than a degree of global warming. And the second is that we would meet net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by the second half of this century. What that means, net zero, means that the amount of greenhouse gases we release into the atmosphere from human activities is balanced by activities that withdraw greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, such as planting trees. But we're not on target to meet those targets. This is an annual report from the United Nations Environment Programme. It's a bit of a busy diagram, but the thing to look at is the so-called unconditional NDC scenario, a dark red line and that top picture. What it's showing us is that our annual emissions of all greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but methane and other greenhouse gases, is well over 50 billion tons at the moment. And if we implement all the promises that have been made in connection with the Paris Agreement at the moment, you add them all up, in 2030 we will have greenhouse gas emission levels that are just the same as now. And that is not consistent with the aim of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees. It's more consistent with us having 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Temperatures that are 3 degrees warmer than pre-industrial haven't been seen on Earth for about 3 million years, during the Pliocene epoch, at which point the polar ice caps were much smaller than today and global sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than today. Let me just now move on very quickly to 2 other major global environmental problems. The first is air pollution. Air pollution kills about 7 million people around the world every year. It kills more than any single infectious disease, and roughly half of those die from the effects of indoor air pollution, mainly in developing countries where people are burning dung and wood for heating and for cooking, and the particles that are generated, they breathe them in and it kills them. The other half die from outdoor air pollution, much of which is generated through the industrial processes and the burning of fossil fuels. Latest estimates in the UK are that about 40,000 people a year have their lives cut short from the effects of outdoor air pollution. But an issue that has been in the news, particularly over the last couple of weeks, particularly if you've seen David Attenborough's new program on extinction, is biodiversity loss. And this is a report that was published last week by the United Nations, looking at progress towards globally agreed targets to tackle biodiversity loss, and we are not going to reach those targets, and they are key. So let me just run through 3 of those targets. One was to slow down the rate of at which species are becoming threatened by extinction. We have not been succeeding, and the latest estimate is almost a quarter of the species that we are able to study in detail are going to be under threat of extinction if we carry on with current trends. The latest estimate is about 1 million species are threatened across all the groups. Deforestation, we are having some success. The rate of deforestation has declined by about 1/3, but it has not stopped, and it is continuing in some of the most sensitive parts, the tropical regions. You will have seen all the coverage of what's happening in Brazil, but it's also important to point out what's happening in places in Indonesia and in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And finally, just because it's relevant to our discussions in the UK about our future agreements with the European Union, is that marine fish stocks are also under threat, and about 1/3 are overfished. The UK has started to tackle this problem by the creation of marine conservation areas, but we must end up with an agreement that gives our fishing stocks time to recover. We have to have a sustainable fishing policy, both in the UK and abroad. So it's a grim picture, I'm afraid. It doesn't mean that we're not making any progress. We are, but we're by no means on the path to dealing with these global environmental problems. And it's a problem not just for the environment, for wildlife, but a problem for us. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and air pollution are all taking an increasing toll on human populations, and that is why we have to, even if we're only interested in our own existence, should be more concerned about it. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for that, Bob. That was a very interesting speech. Lots of information there. I'm not entirely sure that you've made my evening. That left me with a fairly uncomfortable feeling. We are going to run a quick poll, but while that's being run, I'd like to ask you a brief question, if I may, Bob. Do you think that COVID-19 is having any impact on this rather depressing state of affairs? Because it'd be interesting to know if it is, you know, what that might mean going forward.
We know that global emissions of greenhouse gases dropped dramatically during March, when most of the world was in some degree of lockdown and economic activity was reduced. So we saw falls of perhaps 20-30% in emissions levels, but they have now rebounded as countries have started to undergo economic activity again. It's likely that in the long term we may see some reductions if, for instance, people get more used to working from home and so aren't traveling as much. But on the other hand, the big thing that will control to what extent we end up is what happens in economic recovery packages. And if economic recovery packages end up plowing a lot of money into activities that involve consumption of fossil fuels, we'll end up coming out of this crisis by making the climate crisis even worse. So that's why it's very important to look at what the UK and other countries are planning in their economic recovery packages. The package that was announced by the Chancellor in the summer in July included a lot of money for energy efficiency, which is a good thing, but we would hope that in his autumn budget and the results of the spending review, which are due to be announced in the autumn, that there will be further investments in low carbon, accelerating us towards our net zero target in 2050, and does not invest in those activities which will increase emissions.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, Bob. Raj, if you want to go ahead and launch that poll. Give people a minute to just answer that. Right, well, moving on then. Our next speaker is a homegrown Toastmaster who has spent half his life working to help corporations manage risk, much of which is around the environment. Tonight, he's agreed to share with us some of the thinking in corporations about the impact of climate change. So I would like to welcome to the stage Mr. Martin Sutton. Martin.
Just unmute. Thank you very much, Richard. I'll just, as Bob did, I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you will see a presentation come up shortly. And we should go on to slide presentation in a moment. Just give it a second. Right, hopefully we're there. Okay, good evening and thank you very much. I'm being waved at, so I think things are okay. Right. I want to first say I'm a director of risk and assurance and have been for the last 10, 15 years. I'm still gainfully employed by Spar Healthcare PLC, and therefore I need to say I'm speaking in my personal capacity, so hence no shirt and tie. And that the views I express in this presentation are my own views. Climate change, the first time I really came across this was back in 1989. I was traveling through Canada and I went on up to Alaska and I found myself in a place called Skagway. And when I was there, I was only there for 24 hours, and in the bed and breakfast I was staying at, I asked the owner, what do you do in Skagway for a few hours? And he said to me, well, let's face it, you probably will never be back here in your life. So far true. And if you do come back, almost certainly it'll never be clear skies, because we hardly ever get clear skies. So he asked me if I had a credit card, and he asked me to, which I did. And then he said, well, get along to the local airfield and go and fly over the source fields of Glacier Bay. And these are the photographs I took from the aeroplane as we flew over the ice fields. Now, at the top of the source fields, which is the photographs, particularly in the middle and on the left, the ice, apparently, according to the pilot, was 3,000 feet thick, and they had 300 feet of snow every winter at the top. And then we flew down the glaciers, down to the sea where the glaciers met the sea, as you can see on the right-hand photograph. Now, you can still go and see this ice. It is still there, but there's less of it. And it's something that really struck me in preparing for this talk is there is stuff that we may have seen in our lifetime that people will not see for many hundreds of years because it is simply disappearing. The ice is disappearing. It's getting warmer, as Bob pointed out. This very similar slide from the Met Office showing that the warming is going on and we are getting warmer years. The Met Office, one interesting thing was I heard the CEO of the Met Office talking about how, as Bob had said, we've reached 1 degree of warming already. But what was interesting is she said, what we haven't seen, though, are the most extreme weather events we would predict for 1 degree of warming. So there are, if we think our weather is getting more severe, whether it's heat or intensity of rainfall or strength of wind, certainly for the UK, but for the 1 degree of warming we've got, apparently we have not seen the worst of it yet. It might not happen, but it might. And as you know, CO2, as Bob showed, a very similar slide, just going back another 10 years, but it's been increasing. And of course, at the moment, we are on course to continue increasing and continue this warming. So this brings me on to the risks from a corporate point of view, and this is where I really get very interested. It is, what risks do these present to corporates? I would say there are 3 risks I'm going to talk to you about. The first one is the risk of deteriorating weather and what that might mean for operations. The second is around regulation, and the third is around reputation. So to start with deteriorating weather, there are 3 sort of key risks, of course. One is to your buildings in terms of the risks around flooding, intense temperatures, and corporations now are having to think about and build in to their designs for their physical assets in particular, how are we going to cope with more extremes of weather? Now, in the UK, we will get more extremes. That's the forecast from the Met Office, but they won't be evenly distributed. So if you're building a building in the southeast, you're going to have to think harder and longer about heat than you are if you're building a building in the northwest. But if you're building in the northwest, you're going to have to think harder and longer about intense rainfall and potentially flash flooding. And this will translate into how does this affect our people, our employees? Because many buildings, and I show a photograph there on the left of the Shard, but of London, many buildings that we work in aren't designed for the sort of warmer temperatures that are coming. So the Met Office is predicting that if we get to 3 to 4 degrees of warming, the average top temperature will go from an average of 26 degrees in the last decade to somewhere around 33 degrees. That's the average top temperature, which means the extremes will be much higher. And this will have a real impact in terms of the working conditions for employees. So one of the key things that certainly corporates that I'm aware of are having to think about and beginning to think about is, how do you modify your buildings? How do you modify your working practices so that these extremes can be coped with? But this is a risk for business, and it could be quite an expensive risk, depending on the sort of buildings and facilities that you operate in. Another area of risk that is really critical for many organisations is thinking about their supply chain. By the way, I must say, The Economist this weekend has an excellent article, and I have used some of the material in that article. They've done a special briefing on business risks from climate change. And one of the key things that isn't quite so relevant in the world I operate in at the moment, but for many multinationals is supply chain, and particularly, Far Eastern supply chains. So, there's an example. A car has broadly 30,000 components. Many of those components are manufactured in geographically concentrated places. And you may well remember there was an example where Honda a few years ago had to close and stop production in its Swindon plant because of flooding in one of its component manufacturers in Thailand. And it's a good example how the global supply chain, just-in-time supply chain mechanisms have opened up a certain level of risk from these sort of interruptions. But the thing is, it's the geographical concentration is something that's really interesting. And if you've got, business with complex supply chains, it is important to consider them. Some insurers are now really working hard to help their customers understand where those supply chain sort of pinch points are. So on the left, I've got a photograph of Singapore. Now, I'm not saying Singapore is particularly vulnerable, but it's a really, it is like many places, whether it's Port of Dubai or whether it's Southampton here in the UK, it's a key node. Likewise, airports. There are key airports around the world. This is a photograph of Frankfurt, but Heathrow. Many airports around the world are, as it were, really key nodes. And if a large percentage of your components or your finished goods pass through these nodes, it's important to understand what risk those places face from adverse weather events. The second risk is increasing regulation. According to the London School of Economics, there's already 1,900 pieces of environmental legislation worldwide. Excuse me. That is bound to increase. There is no question. Sorry. The regulators will have to regulate to really address the level of CO2 reduction that's needed. Consumers on their own won't be able to push hard enough, or they might not even be in a position to understand how much is needed. But regulation will definitely increase, and companies will have to deal with it. I'm really sorry, my voice is just playing a little trick with me. And voters of the future, if you think the younger generation coming through will really be highly educated in climate change, I've got a teenage daughter, what she knows about climate change is good knowledge and a sophisticated understanding of the issues. They will push their governments for change around the world. And finally, the third risk is reputation. And as we know in this world, reputation can be lost very, very quickly. Social media is very powerful. But there's a couple of things I'd say on reputation. One is, at the moment, it's very hard to attribute cause to specific loss or specific events to climate change itself, except on a global scale. But there are legal firms out there that are now specifically researching and looking at what company directors have done, what boards are doing in order to limit CO2 emissions. So there's no question, law cases will increase and claims will increase. And the reason is that losses are increasing. So the insurance world is seeing increased losses from adverse weather events. Between 2017 and 2019, Swiss Re, another reinsurer, estimated losses at 210 billion per annum. Well, that's going to give the lawyers plenty of incentive to go after companies that they believe have not been acting in the right interest. So there we are. That's some of the risks, counter through the risks that corporates will face and are facing, but will increasingly face. The one big thing I would say that corporates can do to protect themselves against these risks is innovate. And that's a subject for a whole nother speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That's a very interesting dive into what corporations are thinking about when they consider the environment. Raj, if you could run a quick poll after that, and while you do, I'd like to ask Martin, do you have a feel for the velocity that corporations think this is happening at? Are they very much in line with Bob's thinking? Are they moving fast? What's the pace of all this?
I fear that many corporates are not. And that's simply because it's really hard to understand how fast is this change going to come down the line. Now, the Met Office does have a model, I believe, by postcode area that shows over the next 20 or 30 years what they believe will be the change in the ranges of temperature, rainfall in particular, by postcode area. And so the Met Office can help you research of what the implications are on your physical area. And you can pick, October 2025 or November 2030.
Wow. Okay.
It's a very detailed model, but my fear is that actually we're tracking at the upper end of the estimations, as I understand it. We probably don't really understand the potential feedback loops that Bob was, and the tipping points that Bob was referring to. So my worst fear is we actually have underestimated how fast things are going to change because we didn't have the science to understand how fast things will change. But I think it's really important that boards are really getting their heads around this subject and really asking themselves how this is going to change their business. Very quickly, one very interesting point I heard in a conference recently was, ask yourself, what will be socially unacceptable in 10 years' time? Will it still be socially acceptable to eat beef, for example?
I can already see beef disappearing from many menus, but there you go. Well, Martin, thank you very much for that. You're another one that hasn't really made my evening, but we enjoyed your speech. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Valerie Cameron, who is a bioengineer, is that right? Biochemist, sorry, and who has had many years of experience in the corporate world. She has very kindly agreed to take a look at an issue that we call reality versus the fantasy. And this is basically referring to corporations who, like everybody else, corporations and governments want to be seen to be doing the right thing. But their actions don't always match their words. So we've asked Valerie to take a look at that and give us some examples of that. And if I can hand over now to Valerie to take it away. Thank you, Valerie.
Hello, my name is Valerie Cameron. Since the early 1970s, I have been aware of the carbon dioxide emissions from the use of oil, gas and coal and the resulting greenhouse effect, climate change and its devastating potential. I started work as a biochemist and worked as a research assistant in pharmacology. I then moved to the study and research of traditional Chinese herbal medicine, and for 27 years was a practitioner and business partner in a private clinic. During this time, I also grew herbs on a 230-acre property in New South Wales, Australia, and planted native trees to prevent erosion and soil degradation. I value what is ethical, scientifically based, and environmentally responsible. This chart has been shown on others, but it's worthwhile understanding it. The chemistry shorthand term for carbon dioxide is CO2. The greenhouse effect is the high levels of CO2 which cause heating of the entire Earth. The greenhouse effect was first discovered in 1896, and since then the levels have increased rapidly. CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere over time. You'll see that in 2020, CO2 continues to rise at an ever-increasing rate and has reached close to 418 parts per million. In the 1970s, the goal of environmental groups was to reduce the levels to below 300 parts per million, closer to the pre-industrial level. This would have kept the temperature rise between 1/2 and 1/4 degree. Opinion then was that after 1/2 degree increase of global temperature, the effects would be catastrophic and unpredictable. In 2020, the goal is to slow down the rate of increase of carbon dioxide levels and to slow the temperature rise from its present level of over 1 degree. Predictions of temperature rise vary, but the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, predicts we could have a 2-degree rise in temperature by 2050. These coal, oil and gas companies are the worst contributors to the rapidly increasing carbon dioxide emissions through their extraction, production and sale of fossil-fueled products. To prevent climate change, they will have to reduce their production levels. These are the 8 highest carbon dioxide emission contributors. They are fossil fuel companies from Saudi Arabia, USA, Iran, and the UK-based BP is 6th. BP has responded to the increasing public awareness of climate change with a broadly advertised project called Net Zero. I will focus on this BP project because it is based in London and its advertising campaigns for Net Zero are aimed at environmental issues. BP has been accused of greenwashing in its advertising and in the funding of artistic and cultural events. Net zero, what does this mean? To cause their emission contribution to be zero would improve the chances of our world avoiding environmental disaster. The IPCC has stated that achieving net zero by 2050 is too late to avoid the worst effects of climate change, and we need to change much sooner. However, this net zero target is still very important. for the United Kingdom. And as UK citizens, we should know what BP's next net zero project plans to do. BP has a long record of industrial disasters. The maintenance of oil rigs, refineries and pipelines is expensive and eats into profits. As early as 1965, BP was found legally responsible for deaths, explosions and release of environmental toxins through negligence and mismanagement. Over the years, the scale of disasters has increased and their fines have gone from the millions to the tens of billions for the 2010 Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. This has been the largest oil spill accident in history. If someone wanted to store the amount of oil which leaked into the ocean from this environmental disaster, they couldn't use a department store. They would need the entire shopping centre. In 2015, BP was found guilty of gross negligence and willful misconduct and fined $18.7 billion US. Given revenue of over 200 billion and losses through industrial accidents written off, could this misconduct still be their business plan? The next two slides are taken from BP's video campaign to be a net zero company, in which it qualifies in a brief statement that it is net zero for carbon emissions on production by 2050. This is a misleading campaign. Carbon emissions on production is very different from total carbon emissions from the fuel that this company produces. The word production is a term BP used to mean industrial emissions from their factory plants alone. These emissions are 13% of total emissions, much less than the barrels of oil produced and sold. Though not net zero as would be understood from the perspective of climate change and carbon dioxide contribution. How is this net zero on production only to be achieved? Not by improved maintenance and better emission control, but by sponsoring wind farms and some solar schemes and tree planting. And who is assessing this balance, proposed balance? The same management and leadership decision makers who calculate their risk maintenance assessments for the industrial disasters. BP has spent 4% of its operating budget on environmentally sustainable projects. Is this the greenwashing budget with small change left over for some token wind and solar farms? It spends 96% on extracting more fossil fuels. The question is not, will they meet their guidelines in time? It is, do they have any functional guidelines at all? We can make decisions to prevent climate change disasters and mass extinction. We can support organisations that call for UK and international legislation to ensure that environmental projects are truthful, realistic and functional. We can lobby governments to show that these environmental issues are a priority. We can join organisations that are active and effective. I have joined Extinction Rebellion and am a member of the Grandparents Group and also the Scientists Group. And here are some actions that I recommend. The Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, the UN Climate Change Conference called COP26 in Glasgow, the UK Government Parliament Citizens Climate Assembly, and to understand fossil fuel divestment and investment in climate solutions. There are many ways we can be positive about it, and I don't want people to spend their time and their care being distracted by greenwashing advertising campaigns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. That's you're the third tonight not making me very happy, but you did finish on a positive note that we've got something, hopefully, that we can look forward to, and there are things that we can do about it. So if we can run the poll then, Raj, while I ask Valerie a quick question. I noticed David Attenborough in his programme the other night, Extinction, was suggesting that deforestation was a bigger and more urgent issue than rising CO2 levels. How do you think that governments and corporations would respond to that suggestion, and why?
Well, it depends on which government and which corporation. I think people who are looking for profit may find that deforestation may be something that they focus on because it's easier to advertise and they can show pictures of nice trees and animals and we are sponsoring this and that. But there's not much, as far as I'm concerned, that's very, very important and very wonderful. But you can spend all your life on a forest replanting and looking after animals, but if the whole thing just burns up in a wildfire, it's gone. It's gone for good. And that's carbon dioxide levels. We have to address that before we address anything else, or at the same time as we address it. We have to take that seriously. We can't just pat ourselves on the back if we save something or look after a forest. The planet is warming and the fires are burning in the world at the moment.
All right, thank you. Right, now our final speaker is also a fellow Toastmaster. And Paul has, as I well know, many qualities, and being a great speaker is just one of them. But being a competent researcher is also another. So he has kindly agreed to take some time out to see what we average, small citizens can do in order to help the environment. And I'd like to ask him to step forward now to share that information with us. Thank you, Paul.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. The earth is burning. It's on fire. But before we start, I want us to either add to Richard's depression or take away from it. I'm going to ask the audience to use the Q&A and to put a number in there from 0 to 10. 0 if you have no confidence, it's doom and gloom, and 10 if you think we can turn this boat around. So please put a number in there, and that will occupy Richard, and maybe he can feed back to us at the end of this talk. Let's take about 30 seconds. If you could please start putting in some numbers, and get some 7s and 8s and 3s. So we have some optimistic people. Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to crack on. So the earth is burning. We've got incredible fires in California, Australia, yet people deny that climate change is an issue. I wonder why. How is this possible? So even if they are, get this going. Even if people are denying climate change, what about pollution? What about the plastics, the Cabbage Patch, the fish that are eating the plastic that is turning into microfibers and then coming back down onto pristine environments up in the Arctic and in various mountains? What are we doing to this earth? Are we trashing it? Is it the end? Should we just give up now? So tonight, I'm going to suggest that we don't go to Mars because I'm unlikely to get a ticket. But some people are saying, let's double the chance for the human race. Let's go and sit on Mars, and then we can look back and watch the earth burn. I'm not going to make it, so I'm here with you, most of you, unless you're going, to try and do something about it. So when I see this picture, I become sad. I think, well, what's it all about? Is there any hope? So what I would like to do tonight, 2 things. I'd like to take you down. So let's follow the hero's journey, and then I would like to take you back up. So if that's the plan, if we agree to this, let's get going. So let's really get depressed now. So lovely picture. And we've already heard about the Paris Accord, where we've been given a target of let's get temperature changes to below 2 degrees, but ideally we need it to be at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Those numbers, they mean absolutely nothing to me. I cannot visualize, I cannot understand these numbers. So I thought I'll go off and see if I can find out a little bit more. And then to my horror, I found out that NASA think actually those numbers are not achievable and we're going to end up at a 6 degree change. So again, I don't understand the extent of that. I'm imagining koalas hugging trees and on fire. But what does it really mean to us? So again, went off and did a bit more research, found this book. Richard, don't read it. You're not going to be very happy. But in that book, there was an interesting statistic. And let me try and explain it to you. So the wealth in the world at the moment could be equated to around $280 trillion. That's a massive number. I don't get it. It doesn't fit inside my brain. But what they're suggesting is that if we go from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2, that half a degree change will wipe out around $20 trillion. To put that into context, that is roughly about the size of the United States wealth. So we're talking about losing, just by going up half a degree, we're talking about losing the equivalent of the United States. But what's even more scary is that we don't even need to get anywhere near to 6 degrees. At around 3.7, the losses would be around $551 trillion. So forget saving the planet using new technologies and all the rest of it. We won't have an economy. We're all going to be absolutely stuffed, because what is negative $300 trillion? It just makes no sense to me. What I understand from that is we're stuffed. So hopefully I've got you all now nicely depressed. So that means we can begin to work back up. So let's try and do that. I need to ask you a quick question. I'm not going to ask you to put the answer into the poll. If you were to try and name me the nation after the United States and China, what would be the third country causing emissions? Would it be France? Would it be Germany? Would it be UK? Would it be us? Have a think about that. Yeah, you've all got an idea of which country that would be. It would be the country of Catopia. So that tells us something, that we've got our entire economy unbalanced if our cattle husbandry methodologies and creating meat and milk and all the rest of it is causing this amount of CO2. So that suggests that we can do something about our cows. Now, again, doing a bit more research, I came across to London University. They came up with 148 actions, all kinds of actions, planting trees, you name it. It's well worth looking at their document. But what I will do is, a little bit later on, just take some of the main ones that we can act upon. Now, the thing is, why should we take personal action? Why should we not just leave it to the corporates, leave it to the countries and the non-governmental organizations? Just leave it to other people. Why should we as humans, as individuals, take actions? Well, it's quite simple. We can act now. If we ask a government, they've got to pass a law. If we ask business, it's got to fit into their plans. They've got to build new factories. And actually, this might be incompatible with the factory and they won't do it. So actually, as part of solving this problem, it's down to us. We have to do a lot of the lifting. And what does that mean? Well, it means things like having one less child. It means getting rid of the car. It means cutting back on flights. It means switching energy. So we kind of have pretty much all heard of these things, but these kinds of actions are within our control and we can do these things. And another good one is shopping. So when you're out shopping, you send signals. You can change the world. You can boycott products. You can buy better. You can make investments. So a lot of power in the hands of the consumer to make a change. But it's not just us. We have to act as a community as well. So we need to think about other things that we can do, maybe individually, but as a collective as well. Now, I just want to set the scene a little bit. One of our previous speakers talked briefly about technology. Well, AI is coming down the road, and while we can be scared of it, there are some amazing things that we can achieve with AI. Just one example, we can have these containers put outside of supermarkets where we can grow our salads and lettuce and tomatoes in ways that are optimal. And so we can cut back on the food miles, we can have fresh food, and that's an achievement. Also with AI, we can deal with problems at exponential scale. I'm going to come back to that a little bit. So COVID is an example of an exponential scale type of problem. So when COVID hit us across the face, people started trying to use phone calls, contacting banks. There was no way we could respond. However, with AI, with chatbots, we can respond and come up with plans and actions. So technology has a part, and that technology is becoming ripe as we speak now. With access to data and insights, we can make better decisions. Now, as a civilization, we need to work together. The internet is a civilization level technology. It connects us, it gives us capabilities that we could only have dreamed about a few years ago. So something like COVID is a civilization level problem. So using technologies, we can begin to take actions at levels that we could not have imagined before. So this is why I would say to Richard, have hope. We have ways and means which may not be ready right now, but it's there. If only we could implement and move forward. And guess what the good news is? We need a new set of politics. So someone already spoke about citizens' assemblies. This is not new. This goes back to the age of the Greeks, where they had parliaments based on lottery. And why is this a good idea? Well, just look at our current parliament in the UK. It's stuffed full of people, and we don't know if they're acting for us or they're acting for themselves. Yet if we have these citizens' assemblies and we put people in chosen by lottery, then we know that people are taking action on our behalf. They're treating the subject matters with honesty. And this has been demonstrated already before around the world. So Ireland's an example where Citizens' Assembly was used to come up to make a decision around abortion. So it's great that these things are now starting to work, and we just need to get behind them. So I would say there is immense positivity going forward with the technology, with the ability to operate at the civilization level, and with technologies that will support us and give insights and take action. So I think overall, from personal action and with the technology and new things coming down the line, it gives us a chance. So it's better to have a chance than not a chance. So I would say there is hope. So above all, you need to take action. You need to vote. You need to boot out some of these criminals or some of these lesser, shall we say, people who are interested in our interests, but interested in their interests. So by simply voting, we can make a change. So I think there is hope. I think we need to take action. There are things that we can do ourselves. We can have less children. We can change our locomotion. We can work from home. And COVID has given us a playbook. It's exposed our governments. It's exposed that populist governments are not acting for us, and we can use new technologies and new democratic methods to implement change. So I say to you, there is a positive future if we want it. We just need to take action. So thank you. That's me. That's Paul Imrie. Thank you for the opportunity to research this subject. I now hand back to Richard, and hopefully he'll give us an update on the numbers. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Paul. And the numbers were absolutely spread right across the board. I think everybody's got a different opinion on that particular issue. So there was a bit more consensus maybe around the 3s and 4s mark, but that was about it. But thanks for asking that question anyway. So I think we have one final poll that we're going to ask you to answer. And then I would like to encourage you to share any questions that you may have for the speakers on the Q&A, and we will be asking those shortly. In the meantime, I do have a question. I'm not going to ask Paul this one, actually. I'm going to ask Martin, as he gave a fairly corporate presentation. Martin, many of us are lucky enough to have some pension left to invest. What can we do to help the environment in turn? What do you think is a good idea for us to do? What should we be looking for in terms of the environment in investing our pensions? That's a nice question for you, isn't it, Martin?
Yeah, and I honestly, I don't know the answer. There must be now sort of funds out there, and you may, through your pension plans or pension companies, have the ability to choose environmentally friendly or green funds. I know over time there have been funds that would advertise that they wouldn't invest in arms manufacturers, for example, or but I imagine, it would take you asking your pension company or your pension plans, but I imagine there is that sort of.
So raising the issue with them would be a good place to start.
Just even asking the question
will
mean that investment and fund managers are aware that their customers care where their money is invested.
And putting that into a written format so that they have some evidence that they're being asked that question a lot, I guess, would also help.
Yeah, for sure.
Because nobody's going to pay much attention to an administrator saying, "Oh, we're getting lots of questions about the environment," and having no evidence to back it up. So they need something in a written format, I'm guessing. I guess, Bob, I think you've got a point to make on that.
Yeah, can I just make this point? This is when you ask your pension fund what they're doing about climate change, ask them if they know to what extent their funds are exposed to the risks of climate change, because the big issue here is fiduciary responsibility. And if they have all the money wrapped up in oil companies, that's not a good investment. That means you're going to lose money in the long term. So it's not just about doing the right thing, it's doing the smart thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Valerie, I don't know if you've got any input into that, because one of the dangers that I guess we might have is that pension companies are telling us that they're doing all the green things, but in fact it's greenwashing. Is that? Do you have any knowledge about anything like that?
Yes, I do feel that that's going to be a problem. I do echo what Bob says, is just to go to see who they're investing with. That's absolutely key, not what they say and what they do. There are places, but I don't want to talk about anybody in particular, but if you research on Google, use the term divestment, which is about taking assets away from the fossil fuel companies and then putting them in more green areas. You can find ones which are more responsible in that way. So it's not about the advertising, it's about what they do.
What they actually do,
the fossil fuel
I have
companies,
to say, I mean,
yes.
I have to say, and whenever I've tried to look at where my pension company's investing my pension, I hit a wall of of complication that I've struggled to get round.
I think it's not so much yes, look at what your pension fund is doing, but there are organisations which can recommend it, and that's why I say research the term divestment, and then you'll start to get some idea. It's terrible. It is so difficult. I think that's a real gripe I personally have, that it should be legislated to make it very clear, but it's not. But at least there are responsible organisations which you can find via the internet, and using the word divestment is a good way to start and learn about.
Okay. I guess this question should come to all the panel, actually. Does anyone think that COVID gives us a chance to define a new working from home model? And should the city centres redefine themselves to help the environment, I guess? And that comes from Adrian. Any offers to take that up? Valerie, did I see you raise your hand?
Yes, I just wanted to say that when I was there when the swine flu was there, and there were and so many people, medical people, because I was in the area of Chinese medicine, not this horrible.
Valerie, I'm sorry.
Like on the David Attenborough, when big ones occur, as if there would be more. There's a chance for coronavirus, and an improvement in the economy and our way of life, but maybe we just have to get used to the possibility of more epidemics coming because of climate change. It's to do with the forests being reduced, but also to do with the rising temperature and the change in the system, in the soil and in the creatures themselves. The more vulnerable to disease and changes in disease adapting to the habitat. So yes, I think we really have to plan for a changing world, and this is one of the wake-up calls. And definitely, yes, use less fossil fuels in our plans, in government plans.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Bob, yes.
Yeah, so there is a chance, and let's talk about cities in particular. One of the things that's been happening in London, those who are in London may have seen that during this lockdown period, there's been an acceleration of changes to the roads in the city centre, where they're creating more space for pedestrians and more space for cyclists. So even when we go back to normality, and what I define as normality is when we eventually have a solution to COVID, when we have vaccines widely available and we get on top, there will be a move away from more of the traffic, and more of the city centre will be devoted to people who are travelling by bike and by foot. That will not only reduce emissions, it will reduce local air pollution, and it will have other benefits in terms of health, because people will be walking more. On the other hand, if what happens in the interim is that people start saying, well, I'm afraid of getting the virus, so if I travel, I'm going to use a car instead of public transport because I don't want to mix with people, that will raise emissions. So it's really up to us in terms of our changes, and we should be using this as an opportunity. I'm glad that in London, and I think in some of the other city centres, the leadership there has decided now is the time to make the changes to city centres that in the long run will make them better. It won't be without problems. There will be plenty of people, and every taxi driver I've spoken to in London hates what's going on at the moment because change is difficult. But in the long run, I think every analysis shows that city centres that are more friendly to pedestrians and to cyclists are better places to live and work.
Thank you. Martin, I think you've got something to add to that.
Well, just a quick one. I work for a hospital group. We've got 39 hospitals across the country. We have run the group through the biggest change and the biggest crisis that our organisation has faced. And we've done it entirely remotely. So our corporate headquarters in London was closed on the 18th of March. No one has been back except to pick up the odd mail. But we have run an organisation with 13,000 people in it without having any physical meetings. So it's really demonstrated to all of us that we can work in a completely different way. We had, most of us in the senior leadership team are probably certainly over 45, I would say. So we've not had any concept of this real virtual world. Now we do. Now we know we can run a large organisation very efficiently with remarkable agility and flexibility. So I cannot see how we will go back. I can't see how I'll go back to commuting into London 3 or 4 times a week. I just, why would I do that? So I think Adrian's point is right. There will be a change. How big it will be, how it will all play out, I think there are many, many uncertainties.
Well, there are, and one of the uncertainties is, may this do more damage than good? I mean, for example, I've heard a lot of people make that comment, I don't need to work in London anymore. This is brilliant. I'll just sell my expensive house here and move out of the city. But, of course, if everybody does that, then you're heating more houses. And
a similar sort of structural change, if it does happen, and I still believe it's an if, but if it does happen, it will be a similar sort of structural change as we saw in the mining communities when the mines were the industry. But, those affected cities like Manchester and Liverpool, when the docks closed down, the shipyards closed down, all that sort of stuff, it'll be the same structural change, and it will need government intervention to support the locations and the people in those locations through this structural change.
Okay, excellent, thank you. We have a question here from Gwyneth. How and why is IT an answer, given that 10% of energy worldwide is used to facilitate it? I guess that's targeted to Paul, actually, who raised the wonders of AI that we're going to solve the issue, but it's obviously open to all the panel.
Yes, if I can take that one. Absolutely. And actually, if you follow the curve to data center usage, it gets worse. So at some point, data centers will appear at the top of the curve for being absolute nasties for CO2 emissions. That is absolute downside to computing. However, we're all using our social media devices, so we're all contributing to that. So it could be a case of, well, how do we want to go forward as a society? Do we really want to use all these social media tools? So there is a definite downside. However, on the plus side, the ability to look at data to gain insights. Just to give you one example, so farmers are out there spraying fields. At the moment, they could be applying a spray to the entire field and it's not needed. With the IT, with the drones, with the insights, they can measure that and they can carry out precision spraying. So that is an instant gain. We're using less pesticides, we're getting better results, and we're all winning. And yes, there's a cost to that, and that is the IT horsepower and the energy required. Yep, there's no getting away from it. However, what the IT does give us is give us something that we've never had before. As humans, we are terrible with exponential levels of data. We're just no good. We're absolutely rubbish. This is where computers can add value to us. We can look at that data, we can gain insights, and we can do things that we could never conceive before. So that was a very long answer to a question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think to add to that as well, I would say that one of the things that IT is doing is actually working very hard on how to reduce its own carbon footprint. So, yeah, there's a lot of effort going into that space. Anybody else? Martin, you have
just a quick... I read this in The Economist at the weekend, but I love the idea. So there's using AI technologies, I can't remember the name of the organization, but they're looking at once all our cars are electric, we will have however many millions of electric cars with batteries in them. 95% of the time a car is parked. So suddenly you've got an enormous amount of energy storage. So just using AI and how you could potentially hook up all those cars into the grid in a two-way sort of system, you're suddenly going, wow, there are amazing, the potential of amazing solutions using technology. So it's,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. Paul, another one for you as it happens. Would you buy an electric car?
Not at the moment. I think electric cars are relatively new. I think they're probably going to go through generations of improvements. I was reading about the Tesla battery today. So I think it's, I wouldn't buy a new car of any type. I would try and maintain my existing car and just wait a little bit longer. But yes, I think the next car will be electric, but not just yet. I'm just holding out a little bit longer. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. All right, I think we have about 15 minutes left until we have our hard stop. We have the poll results, which we should give to attendees. So I'm being given the results now. Can everybody see these results, or is it just me? You can all see them. Okay, so did we learn? A lot of people learnt something from Bob's talk, obviously. And Willie tells, that's good. Excellent. Lots of people are going to tell people something else about it. So, any more poll results?
Hopefully they didn't learn that I'm just very miserable to be around.
So I'm guessing this is the second talk. So Martin, this is you. More people felt pessimistic after it, although there was if you balanced up the optimistic, and neither of these were still about the same. How businesses should protect themselves from disruption caused by turbulent weather. Insurance, keep suppliers local seems to be the most popular answer to that. Yeah, that's good. Any more? Have you learnt something new about greenwashing today? Most people have. That's good. I'm assuming a lot of the no's already knew quite a lot about greenwashing, Valerie. But yeah, I did. I learnt something new. Any more? So, has this webinar given you ideas about how you can help the environment? Excellent. Well, Paul, you've done your job and you've given us some hope. Most people agreed that they'd learnt some new ideas. And for those that didn't, well, you can always log on to the Lundy University website where Paul pointed to that there's loads and loads of options of things that you can do. And do you plan to come to the next event? Excellent. A number of people do, and many of those who have already signed up. So that's great. Okay, excellent. I'm going to conclude our session there. It's been a great launch event for us tonight. We've had something in the region of about 45 people logging on to watch our panelists have their discussion. It's clear from what we've heard tonight that the planet does have some industrial scale challenges to deal with, but it's also clear that humanity has a habit of overcoming industrial scale problems. And I think by all combining our efforts together, even if it's only at the very small end of the scale, we can make a difference. We do have an email address that you can send any questions that you might have into, and that is info@gxrotary@gmail.com. So any questions or any feedback that you'd like to send in, then please do send that through. We're always looking for more speakers on environmental issues. So if anybody out there would like to speak at some of our up and coming events, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And the next event is going to be on the 9th of October, and it is Wildlife in the Urban Jungle. So please sign up for that. To our panelists, I would like to say a very big thank you. So to Bob, to Martin, to Valerie, and to Paul, thank you very much for all your efforts this evening. Other than that, thanks very much for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and good night.